Thanks, James. So I'm just going to take you through a quick session on connectability, and again, we'll go to the breakout rooms and have some discussion around these areas. I'm just going to talk through the connection strategy that's linked with our business plan, take a look at the significant code review that Ofgem undertook and some of the decisions that they made. Consider our incentive on connections engagement, so that's our pre-ED2 plan to focus on the commitments that we're making this year, and then take a look at some of the work around electric vehicles and heat pumps, en route charging, that type of thing. So just first looking at the major connection strategy, we published this in line with the business plan. It commits to 20 baseline expectations, which fall under 3 high-level principles. So commitments that we're making, commencing from April 2023, in these 3 areas: pre-application, what information can we share with you that's accurate, comprehensive and user-friendly, that helps you to make informed decisions about where you want to connect before you even reach the point of applying to us. The application process, making sure that it's simple, easy to use, that it's transparent in what those processes are and what happens on the back end of you submitting an application. And then looking at the post-acceptance process to make sure that we can facilitate your connections in a timely and economical manner. So we published our current version of the connection strategy on our website, and you'll get these slides so that you've got access to that link. We will consider refining it further following Ofgem's draft determination of the business plan. So if they identify any areas that are missing from the strategy or the business plan, we'll take another look and see whether we need to do anything further. And we'll use the breakout session for this workshop to find out whether there's any areas that you think are missing, whether there are certain priorities that you think we need to really focus on within that strategy that we can take account of when we do that review. If you can move on then, please, Vince. So moving into the significant code review, Ofgem undertook a significant code review about how we charge for connections and how we enable connections to be made to the network to have firm use of the capacity. I'll break that out into 2 sections. So this part looks at the connections boundary reforms, and they made a decision to change the way that reinforcement is funded. This is due to come into effect from April 2023. So the current process, for those of you that are familiar with connections, you would pay for reinforcement at the same voltage you were connecting into and the voltage above. Ofgem want to remove some of the barriers to connecting to the system, particularly in light of moving to a low carbon future. So the decision is that demand connections will no longer pay for reinforcement, subject to a high cost cap that I'll talk about in a second, and that generation only pays for contributions at the same voltage as the point of connection. So they no longer contribute to works at the voltage above. So you can see that both parties have a reduction in their connection contributions from next year. It does create a disparity between demand and generation. So one of the next considerations, and we're working with various DNOs through the ENA to come up with a set of rules. We need to consider what falls in the demand category and what falls in the generation category. Ofgem have set some clear directives, so something that's traditionally demand that takes capacity for other purposes, such as running a factory, domestic premises, etc. That will actually be demand irrespective of whether the generation's driving the reinforcement. So under the charging regime, they won't pay towards the reinforcement to have that generation at a predominantly demand site. Opposite to that, capacity that's for generation storage, that's a pure storage site, not co-located with a traditional demand premises, will be treated under the generation regime. But we're finalising some of the details so that it's clear which schemes will follow the demand and which will follow the generation charging boundary. They're introducing a high cost cap for demand. The generation one's already in place. That's been running for a number of years, and that will remain at £200 per kilowatt. The demand value that you can see is quite high. It's £1,720 per kVA. Ofgem are very clear that this isn't to be a barrier to connecting. It is purely to catch those outliers. So those connections which have a very high reinforcement value versus the capacity that's required for the end connection. And that price was derived from actual data. So DNOs took the last 4 years of connection offers issued, and they looked really at the top 5% of the most expensive schemes versus the benefit delivered. They've also tasked DNOs with revising the speculative development description. At the moment, it's set out in our connection charging statements as to what could be considered speculative, and going forward, speculative developments will continue to pay 100% of reinforcement costs. But what we need to do is refine the specification so that phased developments and future capacity needs, which are currently excluded, and they are determined to be speculative in the current regime, it's not necessarily that just because it's phased or just because it has future needs that it is speculative. So we're now coming up with a new set of rules that allows some of that longer term planning to be considered as non-speculative and benefit from the funding of reinforcement. And then associated with that, we just need to revisit the electricity connection charges regulations. So these are the regulations where a second connecting customer would pay a contribution back to the first customer for utilising assets that have been installed. There'll be no change for extension assets. So if you pay for extension assets to your connection, you will still benefit from recovery for subsequent users that make use of that within the 10-year period. But for reinforcement, we need to make it clear that to benefit from the changes in the connection's boundary, customers no longer pay towards past reinforcement works. There is a little bit of a sticky area that Ofgem and BEIS are working through, and that's customers who paid for reinforcement works either because they were speculative or they requested an enhanced scheme, and they may have invested on the understanding that they would gain some of that money back from future connecting customers. We're very conscious that we don't want to charge the second connectee, but we do recognise that they may have made that investment with some foresight that they'd recover some of the money. So Ofgem and BEIS are just working through potential solutions for passing the rebates through, but from another resource rather than from the second connectee. We could just move on, please, Vince. Access rights. This is about securing the capacity on the network. So if the capacity is available for exactly what the customer needs, that will be a firm connection arrangement, what in the future will determine as a non-curtailable connection. They will have that capacity 24/7, 365 days a year as needed. What we will then look at is non-firm arrangements or curtailable connections. We might use this, for example, where reinforcement is required to enable connections to connect ahead of the reinforcement, but with an option to curtail due to local network constraints, so times of peak demand, for example, or on a seasonal basis. We are going to be setting curtailment limits. So the Ofgem direction sets out that we need to limit the amount of curtailment based on forecasting. If we exceed those limits, we either need to procure services from the market where it's economic and efficient to do so. There will be a price cap set for procuring those services. And if we're unable to procure the services, it could result in a penalty payment that's passed through to the connected customer because we've exceeded those limits. We will also be setting some end dates. So in the current arrangements, we utilise the likes of A&M, but there's no end to that. So the A&M could be enduring. The requirement going forward will be that we set an end date to the curtailed connection. And after that end date, the expectation is that that connection becomes non-curtailed, i.e. they've now got firm access to the capacity that was requested. And that's on the DNOs to make sure that the reinforcement's completed in a timely manner to make sure that that firm arrangement is available after that end date. There's a couple of exclusions to the end dates and to the curtailment limits around customer interruptions from faults. They're excluded from counting as part of the curtailment, and interruptions resulting from the transmission network are also excluded. This is all about interruptions that result from local network constraints on the distribution system. There's also exceptions to the end date where a customer may choose to have a more enduring arrangement. For example, they might want to not pay towards the reinforcement works under the high cost cap, or for the same voltage reinforcement under the generation connections boundary. And so they may opt for a long-term solution, and in those instances we won't apply an end date. If we can move on, thank you. Incentive on connections engagement. This has been running for several years now, and it is coming to an end. This is our final year, and next year will be replaced by the connection strategy. But although it's coming to an end, we've not stopped engaging with our customers. We've not stopped committing to make improvements ahead of ED2. We are looking at improving customer service. We published at the end of May and made some commitments around enabling self-service applications, digital solutions to apply for connections and follow those through on an end-to-end scheme basis. To improve consistency by implementing various system solutions like an LCT online application process, which allows an immediate decision on whether the low carbon technology can be accepted, the likes of EV chargers at domestic premises, for example, and the Connections Customer Portal Inquiry Tracker. So a tracker that allows you to see where in the process your scheme is through to energisation. And improving connectability for our customers. So some of the steps that we need to make now to prepare for the commitments we've made in ED2. We will be publishing a final report in October, which allows us to submit a few more initiatives that we're expecting to deliver over the next few months. So if there are areas that you think we need to prioritise for this year, that will come out in the discussion session and we can include them in our October resubmission. Moving on to electric vehicle and heat pump. We've published our strategies and they've been going for a while now. We're going to review these on an annual basis, and actually they're under review at the moment. The strategies cover our overarching plans to support installations of electric vehicle charging and heat pumps. They consider the use of smart solutions and flexibility where it's available, and they set out WPD's commitments to facilitating these types of connections onto our system. As well as the strategies themselves, there's a number of guidance documents, including guides for local authorities, guidance for businesses and guidance for drivers, and how they interact with what we do as a business. So they're available on the website to view. The updated version is currently being refined and should be published by the end of this month on those same links. So if you access those links from July, you'll be able to see those. Moving on from the strategies then, we're starting to get into some of the detail about what we're doing around EVs, particularly thinking about en route charging and motorway service areas. We've been engaged in discussion with OZEV, so the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, and the Energy Networks Association to find ways of securing assets that consider the future needs for motorway service areas under a build once approach. And that once that capacity is built, there's a ramping profile. We anticipate, we're not expecting customers to want all of the capacity now, but we want to put in the assets that are ready for the future requirements. And the benefits of doing that, it allows the capacity to be available at the time of need. It ensures that the application of use of system chargers, so the capacity chargers, is in line with an agreed profile, rather than the current process of charging the full requested capacity from energisation. There's a benefit to us in that we have foresight of the future needs. Without this ramping approach, customers may incrementally request the capacity on an as they need it basis, and we'd have no idea of what capacity may be coming down in the future. So having foresight of the end goal allows us to better prepare the network to carry out network reinforcement on a more strategic level. And it also takes account of the Ofgem direction that future need doesn't necessarily mean that a scheme is speculative. If there's a really good forecast of what the capacity requirements are, we can take those into account, but work with the customer to make sure that it is delivered as it is needed. So the process will look at an annual increase of agreed capacity. It'll update automatically on an annual basis from energisation in line with an agreed profile to ramp that capacity. And that ramping profile will translate to the capacity charges that are applied to that connection on an annual basis. And we'd expect the customer to initiate reviews to adjust that ramping profile. It's not set in stone. We do accept that there's going to be times when capacity may be underutilised in some areas. We accept that in some instances it may be accelerated and needed earlier than anticipated. And early engagement is a good thing for both parties, because one, it makes sure that the customer's capacity charges in each year reflect what they actually need in terms of capacity. And it also allows us to better determine our reinforcement needs. If capacity is accelerated, we may need to look to bring that reinforcement forward. If utilisation is lower than anticipated, we can look to move some of that reinforcement back and not actually undertake that spending just yet. So looking at the process for that, there's a few key principles. One is that the process should support a minimum overall cost to users of the distribution networks. And as far as we see it, the build once approach, rather than incrementally going back, digging up the road and replacing a cable with a larger one, and then a few years later going back, replacing with a larger one again, that's not really a minimum overall cost for use of system customers. We want to make sure that we are benefiting from the minimum overall cost, but taking account of future need. We're also minded to think that this should be available for all customers. So whilst it's been triggered specifically around motorway service areas, we don't see why this shouldn't be available to any customer that has a justifiable need to ramp their capacity requirements over time. And we believe this approach should promote the efficient development and use of the distribution system. So having clear foresight of future capacity needs allows us to be more strategic in our planning rather than inefficient incremental changes to the network. It adds in a couple of steps to the process. So we would expect a detailed pre-application surgery so that we can really get to grips with what the customer's needs are, what their capacity ramping profile looks like, and we can relay what the potential reinforcement looks like and when we think that may need to come on board. We'll move through formal offer, acceptance and construction, which is as per the current process. But then after energisation, we move to this capacity management process on an ongoing basis to make sure that we monitor that annual ramp up, that it is being taken up in line with that or adjusted where needed, and that we can use that to optimise our reinforcement provision. And so there's a couple of considerations. Is it right that we think about extending this to other customers, and is this a good approach for fair treatment whilst minimising the capacity charge and not charging the full capacity at the outset? And then finally, whilst thinking about en route charging, there's consideration of long haul transport, so HGVs. Up until now, Project Rapid have undertaken modelling out to 2035, which was for light cars and vans, and there was no consideration in that of HGVs. Yet we do know that HGVs account for 5% of the total mileage, but produce 16% of the UK emissions. So there's quite a significant impact from HGVs being on our roads. Production of HGVs falls within the EU generally, and therefore they're subject to EU regulations. So there's a couple of things coming ahead which will be taken account of anyway, which is reductions in emissions of 15% by 2025 and increasing that to 30% by 2030. And manufacturers need to make sure that at least 2% market share of new HGVs is made up of zero and low emission vehicles. So those targets mean that some kind of possible battery storage HGVs or battery HGVs is going to be coming online, but a Project Rapid modelling hasn't taken that into account. So we need to consider whether we should be looking at that and encouraging the inclusion of HGVs into Project Rapid and considering what the challenges may be around accounting for possible battery or hybrid HGVs in the future. There are some things we've been working on. We've been working on high power charging systems that take up a smaller footprint, which is useful for motorway service areas to take up less room to provide a mega volt output. But there's possibly more that we can be doing in this area.